All right, so you ready to dive into this?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, awesome. We're going deep into trauma. Uh, Specifically with this book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting to look at um, how it affects us physically, not just mentally.
Right, because it's not just in our heads.
Exactly. And you gave me all these notes from the book, and it's pretty mind-blowing stuff. We've got real-life stories, tons of research on the brain.
And the research is really fascinating, like how trauma changes the brain.
Yeah, and then like all these different ways to approach healing.
Because there isn't just one way to deal with trauma, you know?
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that this book really dives into, how the body, not just the mind, holds on to these experiences.
Yeah, it's like our bodies are keeping score, even when we're not aware of it.
Okay, so let's start with this guy, Tom, the Vietnam veteran, who Kolk introduces at the beginning of the book. He's wrestling with these intense flashbacks, uncontrollable rage.
Oh yeah, Tom's story. It's really powerful. And he's dealing with emotional numbness, too.
Right, and it's like this invisible weight he's carrying around,
Mm.
and it's affecting everything. His relationships with his family, his friends, his ability to just function in the world.
And that's what's so important to understand about trauma. It doesn't just affect the individual, it has this ripple effect that impacts everyone around them.
Exactly. And what I found really interesting is that Kolk's own family history with trauma kind of sparked his passion for this field. Back in the 70s, there was very little research on trauma.
Right, it was almost like a taboo subject, like nobody wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, thankfully that's changing. But there's still so much we don't know and so much stigma surrounding it.
Absolutely. But people like Van der Kolk are really shining a light on this issue and helping us understand the profound impact trauma has on our lives. And this idea of the body keeping score is so central to his work. He uses this really interesting example with the Rorschach test.
Oh yeah, those ink blot things.
Exactly. So when he showed these ink blots to Vietnam veterans, some of them saw these vivid, often disturbing images related to their trauma. It was like their past experiences were shaping how they saw the world, even in these random shapes.
Wow, that's pretty intense. So their trauma was literally influencing their perception.
Right. But then on the other hand, some veterans saw absolutely nothing, a complete blank. It's like their minds were shutting down, blocking out any potential triggers.
So it's like trauma can push the brain to either relive the experience constantly or shut down completely to protect itself.
It's like a survival mechanism, but it can become a problem when it starts to interfere with a daily life.
Right, because it's like living in a constant state of either hypervigilance or numbness, and that takes a toll. Speaking of which, this is where it gets really interesting, how trauma actually hijacks the brain's alarm system, that fight or flight response.
That's a great way to put it. It's like your body is constantly on high alert, even when there's no real danger present.
So it's like living in a perpetual state of danger, even when you're perfectly safe. And that can be exhausting, both mentally and physically.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this, Van der Kolk introduces us to Stan and Ute, this couple who survived a horrific car accident.
Oh, I remember reading about them. They were both physically okay, but they were really struggling in the aftermath.
Right. Even months after the accident, they were plagued by anxiety, insomnia, nightmares. Their brains were essentially stuck in that trauma response. It's like their bodies hadn't caught up with the fact that the danger was over.
So how does this actually work in the brain? I mean, what's going on neurologically?
Well, it all comes down to what Van der Kolk calls the emotional brain. And this part of the brain, it's focused on survival.
So we're talking about those primal instincts, that fight or flight response that kicks in when we sense danger.
Exactly. And the key player here is the amygdala, which is this tiny almond-shaped structure in the brain that's responsible for processing fear and triggering that fight or flight response.
So when we experience a threat, the amygdala goes into overdrive, sending out all those signals that get our hearts racing, our palms sweating, our muscles tense.
Right. But the problem with PTSD is that the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It's constantly on high alert even when there's no real danger.
So it's like your brain is stuck in this survival mode even when there's nothing to survive. That must be incredibly overwhelming.
It is. And what's even worse is that this overactive amygdala can actually start to override the prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex is like the CEO of the brain, right? It's in charge of logic, reasoning, decision-making.
Exactly. So when the amygdala is in control, it's like the emotions are calling the shots and rational thought goes out the window. And that's why people with PTSD often struggle with things like impulsivity, difficulty concentrating, and making clear decisions.
It's like their emotions are hijacking their ability to think straight.
Right. And it's not just their thoughts, it's their behaviors too. They might engage in risky behaviors, have angry outbursts, or withdraw from social situations.
Because their bodies are constantly on edge, bracing for that next perceived threat.
Exactly. And this is one of the key insights from The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma isn't just a psychological issue, it's a physiological issue. It's about how our bodies respond to stress and how those responses get stuck in overdrive.
So it's not just about changing our thoughts and beliefs. It's about changing our physical responses, our neurobiology, the way our bodies react to the world.
Exactly. And that's where these alternative therapies come in, things like EMDR and somatic experiencing, which we'll talk about later. But for now, I think it's important to just acknowledge the profound impact that trauma has on the brain and the body. It's not just in our heads, it's in our cells, in our nervous system, in our very being.
And what's fascinating is that Kolk doesn't just focus on adult-onset trauma. He also goes into the profound impact of childhood experiences. His work with abused children and the findings of the ACE study are really eye-opening.
Oh, the ACE study. Yeah, that was a groundbreaking study. It showed how common adverse childhood experiences are and how they can have these long-lasting consequences for our health and well-being.
So we're talking about things like abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, growing up in poverty.
Right, all those things that can create a sense of chronic stress and instability in a child's life.
And what's really concerning is that for each additional adverse experience a child goes through, the risk of negative outcomes later in life, like heart disease, diabetes, depression, substance abuse, all of that, it goes up exponentially.
It's like each traumatic experience adds another layer of vulnerability, another layer of risk.
So it's not just about the individual events, it's about the cumulative impact of those experiences over time.
Exactly. And this means that a lot of people we encounter every day could be carrying this unseen burden of childhood trauma.
Right, it's like this hidden wound that shapes how they interact with the world. And that's why it's so important to approach others with empathy and understanding, because you never know what someone might be carrying with them.
You really never know what battles people are fighting. And to illustrate just how profoundly these early experiences shape a child's worldview, Kolk did this fascinating experiment with picture cards. He showed these cards to two groups of children, one group that had experienced abuse and another group that hadn't.
So these were just neutral images, right?
Yeah.
Not anything inherently disturbing.
Right. But the children who had been abused consistently saw threatening or sexualized imagery in the cards, even when the pictures were completely innocent.
Wow, so their past trauma was literally distorting their perception, making them see danger where it didn't exist.
It's like their brains were wired to see threat everywhere, even in the most benign situations. And this is where John Bowlby's attachment theory becomes so relevant. Bowlby believed that a secure attachment with caregivers is crucial for a child's emotional and social development. And when those early attachments are disrupted or insecure, it can have a lasting impact on how we relate to others and how we cope with stress.
So it's not just about the traumatic event itself, it's also about the context in which it occurs. If a child has a safe and loving caregiver to turn to, they're more likely to develop the resilience they need to navigate those difficult experiences. But if those early relationships are characterized by fear, neglect, or abuse, it can create this underlying sense of insecurity and distrust that makes it harder to cope with trauma.
Exactly. And Kolk really delves into the different attachment styles, secure, avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized, and how they can play out in our relationships and our emotional lives.
Because those early patterns of relating to others often get carried into adulthood, shaping how we form bonds, how we communicate, and how we deal with conflict. It's like those early experiences create a blueprint for how we navigate the world.
And what's even more fascinating is that these early experiences don't just shape our psychology, they can actually alter our biology on a genetic level.
This is where we get into epigenetics, the study of how our environment can influence gene expression.
Right, and it's not about changing the genes themselves, it's about switching certain genes on or off.
So basically, our experiences, especially those early in life, can actually leave a mark on our DNA. And these epigenetic changes can then influence everything from our stress response to our overall health and well-being.
Exactly, it's like our experiences get woven into our very biology.
Kolk uses some really compelling examples to illustrate this, like studies showing that nurturing behavior in rats can actually change the expression of genes related to stress, making those rats more resilient to stress later in life.
And then there's the ice storm study, which looked at pregnant women who experienced a severe ice storm in Quebec.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Researchers found that the stress from that event actually impacted the DNA of their children.
So even events that happen before we're born can shape our biology and our vulnerability to stress and mental health issues later in life. It's incredible and kind of scary at the same time.
It really highlights the power of our experiences, both positive and negative, to shape who we are, both physically and psychologically. But the good news is that just as our experiences can create these epigenetic changes, we can also create experiences that reverse those changes or create new, more positive patterns. That's the power of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt throughout life.
Wow, so we've seen how trauma can lodge itself deep within the brain and body, impacting everything from our perception and memory to our emotional regulation and even gene expression. But what about treatment? Can these deep-seated wounds ever truly heal? That's what we'll explore after the break. Stay tuned.
I'm looking forward to it. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how the body keeps the score really challenges us to rethink our understanding of trauma.
Yeah, and we started to see how deeply trauma can actually impact the brain. It's not just about our feelings and memories, right?
No.
Like there are actual physical changes that occur in the brain as a result of trauma.
It really is. It's wild. And remember we talked about the amygdala, that little alarm bell in the brain that triggers the fight or flight response?
Right.
Well, Kolk goes into how chronic stress, and that's what you experience with ongoing trauma, can actually shrink another part of the brain called the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus, that's really important for forming and retrieving memories.
That's right.
So for someone dealing with the aftermath of trauma, could this be why their memories feel so fragmented or just completely inaccessible?
It very well could be.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle, but you're missing all these crucial pieces.
Exactly.
You know something happened, but the details are just hazy or they're just completely gone.
And beyond memory, the hippocampus also plays a role in our sense of space and time.
Oh, interesting.
So this damage can lead to feeling really disoriented, almost like you're detached from reality, which
Oh.
a lot of trauma survivors describe.
Right, I can see how that would contribute to that feeling of, like, being ungrounded or like your world's been turned upside down.
It's as if their internal compass is just broken.
Yeah, I get it.
And Kolk doesn't stop there. He also discusses the thalamus.
Okay, remind me, what's the thalamus do again?
So the thalamus acts like this central relay station for sensory information,
Okay.
taking input from all our senses and then sending it to different parts of the brain for processing.
So it's like the traffic cop of the brain, making sure all the sensory information gets where it needs to go.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm following you.
But when someone experiences trauma, it can really disrupt this whole integration process.
Okay, so what happens then?
So instead of having this smooth, integrated flow of information, it's like everything's coming in as these disjointed bits and pieces,
So sounds and images and sensations all jumbled up.
all jumbled up.
Wow, I can't imagine.
And this is where it gets really interesting because it's not just the higher brain centers that are affected by trauma.
Okay, so like what else?
Trauma can even impact the brainstem, the most primitive part of the brain that controls things like breathing and heart rate.
Oh, wow. So that's like the most basic level of functioning.
Right.
And that gets messed up.
It does, and it makes sense if you think about it. You know, when we experience a threat, that fight or flight response kicks in.
Right.
And it sends this surge of adrenaline coursing through the body.
It's getting us ready to either fight or run away.
Right, and the brainstem is basically in charge of orchestrating this whole physiological response.
Okay, so what happens after the trauma?
So even after the traumatic event is over, the brainstem can remain dysregulated.
Like it's stuck in that fight or flight mode.
Stuck, either in a state of hyperarousal or the opposite, a shutdown response.
Okay, so that explains why some survivors are constantly on edge, right? Like super jumpy, easily startled,
Yes.
while others go in the complete opposite direction and become totally numb and withdrawn.
Right, and it's like their body's just bracing for impact, but the danger has passed.
But their nervous system is still stuck in that survival mode.
And this chronic state, this being in either hyperarousal or shutdown, it takes a toll on the body over time.
Right. So it increases the risk for all kinds of physical health problems down the road.
It does.
Wow. It's like this is the mind-body connection in its most profound sense.
Absolutely.
Trauma doesn't just affect our mental and emotional well-being, it has real physical consequences.
And I think that's one of the things Van der Kolk does so well in this book is he connects those dots. He helps us understand how those psychological and physiological responses are intertwined.
Okay, now remember in the intro we briefly mentioned mirror neurons.
Yeah,
Van der Kolk actually dedicates a good chunk of this book to these little guys.
he does. It's fascinating stuff. Mirror neurons are essentially what allow us to understand and empathize with other people.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
They fire both when we perform an action ourselves and when we see someone else performing that same action.
So it's like our brains are mirroring what we're observing,
Yes.
and that allows us to tap into that other person's experience.
Exactly. It's like we're simulating what it would be like to be in their shoes.
Okay, so they're crucial for things like empathy, imitation, and just our ability to connect with other people.
Right.
But what's the link to trauma?
Well, trauma often involves this breakdown in social connection,
Right. Survivors often feel really isolated and misunderstood.
alone in their experience. And because trauma can actually impair the mirror neuron system, it becomes even harder for them to connect with other people.
To feel seen and understood.
And that's why it's so crucial to create a safe and supportive environment where survivors can start to rebuild those essential social connections.
And remind them that they're not alone.
Exactly.
Wait, now beyond that broader impact on brain systems, Van der Kolk explores some specific challenges that often come up for trauma survivors,
Yeah, there are quite a few.
like alexithymia. Have you ever heard of that?
Alexithymia, yes.
I hadn't until I read this book.
It's basically a difficulty identifying and expressing your emotions.
So someone with alexithymia, they might know that they're feeling something, but they can't quite put it into words or even really understand what the feeling is.
Exactly. They might say things like, I feel weird, or something feels off.
But they struggle to articulate what's actually going on emotionally.
And it makes perfect sense that this would be linked to trauma, because often, as a way of coping with these overwhelming experiences, survivors will disconnect from their feelings.
It's like a defense mechanism, a way of protecting themselves from further pain.
It is.
But in the long run, this emotional numbing can make it incredibly difficult to process those emotions, to form healthy relationships, and just really engage in life.
Right. It's like you're living behind a wall, cut off from your own feelings and the emotional world of others.
So how do you even begin to help someone who's struggling with this? Like, can they ever break through that wall?
It's definitely possible.
But I imagine it takes a lot of time and patience.
It does. Therapy often focuses on helping them reconnect with their bodies, to start noticing and labeling their physical sensations.
Because often the body remembers, even when the mind has blocked things out.
Exactly. It's like helping them tune into those subtle cues from their bodies.
Like a racing heart or a tightening in the chest.
And then gradually start to connect those sensations to specific emotions.
It's like learning a new language.
The language of emotions.
That's a great way to put it.
And along with alexithymia, another really common challenge for trauma survivors is shame.
Shame is such a heavy emotion.
It is.
It's that feeling of being fundamentally flawed or unworthy.
It can be incredibly isolating.
Yeah, it's like carrying around this secret burden that makes you feel like you don't deserve love or connection.
And trauma often exacerbates those feelings of shame, especially if the trauma involved abuse or neglect.
Right, because it's so easy to fall into that trap of self-blame.
Thinking, this happened to me because I'm bad, or I deserve this.
Yeah, even though logically you know it's not true, that feeling of shame can be so deeply ingrained.
And it makes it so difficult to open up to other people, to seek help.
To believe that you're even worthy of healing.
It's like this invisible barrier that keeps you stuck.
So how do you help someone break free from that shame spiral?
How do you help someone who's trapped in that self-blame and unworthiness? It starts with validation, letting them know that their feelings are understandable,
That they're not to blame for what happened.
that their reactions are normal, natural responses to these traumatic experiences.
So it's about replacing that self-judgment with compassion and understanding.
Exactly.
It's like holding up a mirror to their strengths and their resilience.
Reminding them that they survived, they kept going, and that in itself is a testament to their inner strength.
It's about reclaiming their worthiness, their power.
And along with shame, another major hurdle for a lot of survivors is difficulty regulating their emotions.
Right, we touched on this earlier in relation to the overactive amygdala and that impaired prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
So it's like their emotional thermostat is just broken.
That's a great analogy.
They might experience these wild mood swings, go from 0 to 60 in a split second, have panic attacks seemingly out of the blue, or just feel completely numb and disconnected.
It's like being on this emotional roller coaster that you can't get off of.
And this constant state of emotional dysregulation,
Yeah.
it makes it so hard to just navigate daily life,
It does.
to hold down a job, to maintain relationships, to just feel any sense of peace and stability.
And it can be really frustrating for survivors because they feel like they're losing control.
So is there anything that can be done to help them regain some of that control?
Fortunately, there are a number of really effective approaches.
Okay, like what?
Kolk talks about mindfulness practices,
Yeah.
grounding techniques, somatic therapies.
So mindfulness, that's about learning to pay attention to the present moment without judgment,
Exactly. And that can be really helpful in interrupting those automatic reactions.
creating space for choice.
And grounding techniques, those are all about bringing yourself back to the here and now when you feel like you're starting to spiral.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, what's a grounding technique?
It could be as simple as focusing on your breath, noticing the feeling of your feet on the ground, engaging your senses by paying attention to the sights, sounds, and smells around you.
So it's like throwing an anchor down to keep you from drifting away in that storm of emotions.
Exactly. And then there are somatic therapies.
I know Kolk is a big fan of those. What are those all about?
So somatic therapies, like somatic experiencing, really focus on helping people release the trapped energy and tension that can get locked in the body after a trauma.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's based on the idea that trauma disrupts the body's natural fight-or-flight response.
Leaving us stuck in a state of hypervigilance or shutdown,
So it's about helping the body complete that stress response cycle
allowing it to discharge that pent-up energy.
and move toward a state of relaxation and equilibrium.
And that can have a profound impact on emotional regulation,
It does,
reducing those really intense reactions.
creating more space for calmness and stability.
It sounds really promising.
And I think it's important to remember that even though we've been talking a lot about the challenges and the struggles of trauma, survivors are incredibly resilient people.
Oh, absolutely. They faced incredible adversity and they found ways to keep going. We have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. We need to honor that strength and recognize the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most difficult experiences.
That's a really important point. And healing is always possible.
It might not be linear,
It's certainly not easy.
but with the right support, with the right resources, individuals can recover from trauma and create fulfilling lives. It's about reclaiming their power, their voice, and their sense of hope.
And it's inspiring to think about all the different paths to healing. We've touched on EMDR, mindfulness, grounding techniques, somatic therapies, but Kolk explores a whole range of other approaches as well.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. Like, what else did you find interesting in his therapeutic toolkit?
Well, we talked about theater earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting.
Okay, yeah.
Kolk emphasizes the healing power of creative expression.
I love that.
And theater provides this incredible outlet for survivors to really explore and express their experiences in a safe and structured environment.
It's like taking those internal struggles, all that pain and confusion, and giving them an external form.
A way to make them tangible, a way to make them manageable.
And it's not just about catharsis,
Yeah.
right? Like just releasing those pent-up emotions.
Right.
Theater also allows for a sense of agency.
Absolutely. Participants can reenact, they can rewrite their traumatic narratives, and it gives them a sense of control over their stories.
It's like taking back the pen and writing a new ending.
Exactly. And along with theater, Kolk highlights the importance of two really fundamental human needs that are often disrupted by trauma:
What are those?
play and social connection.
Yeah, we touched on social connection earlier.
But it's worth emphasizing again.
Because we are social creatures. We thrive on connection.
We need to feel seen and heard and understood by other people.
But trauma can make it so hard to form and maintain those bonds.
It can. It can lead to isolation, to withdrawal, to a really deep fear of vulnerability.
Right, it makes sense. But it's like this vicious cycle. Because the more isolated you feel, the harder it is to reach out and connect with others.
And that's why it's so important to create a safe and supportive environment where survivors can start to rebuild their capacity for connection.
So that could be through therapy groups, support groups, or even just spending time with trusted friends and family.
It is.
Taking small steps, building trust gradually, and just rediscovering the joy of human connection.
It's about remembering that you're not alone, that there are people who care and who want to help you heal.
And then there's play, which might seem frivolous in the context of something as serious as trauma, but it's actually incredibly important.
It is.
Play is how we learn. It's how we connect. It's how we tap into our creativity and our joy.
It's about letting go of control, embracing spontaneity, and allowing ourselves to just be fully present in the moment.
It's like giving yourself permission to be silly, to laugh, to have fun, even after experiencing something terrible.
Exactly.
It's about reclaiming your right to experience the fullness of life. And for trauma survivors, play can be especially healing
It can.
because it can help them reconnect with their bodies, release tension, and rediscover a sense of safety and trust.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that we're not defined by our experiences,
Right.
that we have the capacity to grow and change.
And that with the right support and resources, we can heal from the wounds of the past and create a brighter future.
It's a powerful reminder that healing is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, there will be setbacks and breakthroughs.
But the most important thing is to just keep moving forward, one step at a time, with compassion for yourself.
And the belief that healing is possible.
Now, before we wrap up this part, I want to touch on one last key concept from The Body Keeps the Score.
Okay.
Kolk really emphasizes the importance of self-regulation.
He does.
So this is that ability to manage our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors in a healthy way.
It's like having a good internal thermostat.
So it allows you to maintain a comfortable emotional temperature, stay cool under pressure.
And warm yourself up when you're feeling down.
But trauma can really throw that system out of whack,
It can.
leading to those intense mood swings, impulsive behaviors, difficulty coping with stress that we talked about earlier.
It's like your internal thermostat is stuck on either scorching hot or freezing cold. There's no in between.
A very accurate description, I would say. So a huge part of healing from trauma is learning how to re-regulate your nervous system
Yes.
to bring that internal thermostat back into balance.
It's about developing a toolbox of strategies that you can use to calm yourself down when you're feeling overwhelmed.
And to access your inner resources when you're feeling depleted.
Exactly.
Like becoming the master of your own emotional domain.
And so what kinds of tools are we talking about here?
So we've already touched on some of them, right? Mindfulness practices, breathing exercises, grounding techniques.
These are all incredibly powerful tools for regulating the nervous system and creating a sense of calm and stability.
It's like building a muscle for emotional resilience. Learning to ride the waves of your emotions without getting pulled under.
And beyond those core practices, there's a whole world of other things that can support self-regulation.
Like what?
Movement, creative expression, spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones,
It's really about finding what works for you.
and making it a part of your daily life.
It's about creating a lifestyle that supports your well-being on every level.
Physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual.
And that's the essence of The Body Keeps the Score. It's about recognizing that profound impact of trauma
Understanding how it manifests in the brain and the body.
and discovering the many paths to healing and wholeness.
It's a message of hope, of resilience, of the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome adversity.
And with that, I think we've covered the core concepts from The Body Keeps the Score related to the impact of trauma and the different approaches to healing. What resonated most with you?
You know, what really struck me was that emphasis on the mind-body connection.
Oh, yeah.
How trauma doesn't just affect our thoughts and feelings, it has these profound effects on our physical well-being. And the idea that healing isn't just about talking about our problems, it's about addressing those deep-seated wounds on a physical level through things like yoga, somatic experiencing, and even just being in nature.
Yeah, it's this holistic approach to healing.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that our beings are all interconnected.
And I think that's a really powerful message for anyone who's struggling with the aftermath of trauma.
It's not just about fixing your mind, it's about healing your whole self.
Well said.
So in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore what Kolk has to say about the broader implications of trauma, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
It's a really important conversation because it's not just about individual healing, it's about creating a world that's more trauma-informed and compassionate.
Exactly. Stay tuned to discover how we can create a more trauma-informed world where healing is not just possible, but probable. Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. We've really been digging into the science of trauma and all the different ways that it shows up in our lives. But, it's one thing to understand it, but what do we actually do with this information?
Yeah, that's the big question. In this last part, we're going to explore what Kolk says about the bigger implications of trauma, both for people trying to heal and for society as a whole. He wants us to completely change how we think about and approach trauma and to make the world more compassionate.
So let's start with the individual. We've already talked about how just talking about your problems in therapy isn't enough and that we need those more holistic approaches that address the mind, body, and spirit. But I'm curious, does Van der Kolk think there are things in society, like beliefs or systems, that make healing harder?
Oh, definitely. One thing he really criticizes is how much we rely on medication as the main treatment for trauma.
Yeah.
Now, medicine definitely has a role in managing some of the symptoms, especially in the short term,
Right.
but he's cautious about using it just to suppress emotions.
Without getting to the root of the problem.
Right. It's like taking painkillers for a broken leg, you know? You might not feel the pain, but it's not actually healing the injury.
Gotcha.
So he emphasizes how important it is to combine medication, if you need it, with those other therapeutic approaches that help people work through their trauma, calm their nervous system down, and develop good ways to cope.
Like all that stuff we talked about, EMDR, somatic experiencing, yoga, mindfulness.
Exactly. Things that work directly with the body and the nervous system. Because healing isn't just about changing what you think, it's about changing how your body reacts to stress and triggers.
Rewiring the brain to feel safe again.
Exactly. And besides over-medicating, van der Kolk also doesn't like how we often label people who've experienced trauma. You know, we focus on what's wrong with them instead of asking what happened to you.
That's a big difference in how you see someone, right?
It is.
Instead of seeing someone as broken, you start to see them as a person who's been hurt and is carrying that weight.
And even just changing the language makes a big difference in how we treat and support people. It's about empathy and understanding, not judgment and shame.
So just creating a space where people feel safe enough to share their stories, be vulnerable, and actually believe that they can heal.
That's the goal. And van der Kolk does criticize the system, but he's also hopeful about the future. He talks about trauma-informed care,
Trauma-informed care, okay.
which is all about understanding the impact of trauma and creating environments that help people heal.
So I'm thinking schools, hospitals, workplaces, even our courts and jails.
Right. All those systems need to be sensitive to people who've gone through trauma.
Because otherwise you could accidentally re-traumatize them without even knowing it.
Exactly. It's about realizing that when someone's behavior is difficult or disruptive, a lot of times it's because of trauma.
So punishment isn't the answer.
It's not.
You need to provide support, understanding, and resources to help people heal.
We need to create a culture of compassion and resilience. And this ties into van der Kolk's big vision of a trauma-conscious society.
Trauma-conscious society, okay. What does that even look like?
It means we don't just treat trauma after it happens, but we try to stop it from happening in the first place.
So it's about dealing with the root causes of trauma.
Exactly. Poverty, inequality, violence, oppression, all those things contribute to trauma, and we need to make the world more just and equitable.
It's prevention as much as it is treatment.
Right. It's building communities where people feel safe, supported, connected. That way, they're less likely to experience trauma in the first place.
And that makes sense because trauma isn't just a personal issue. It affects everyone. What happens to one person impacts their family, their community, and society as a whole.
We're all interconnected.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this deep dive. What was the biggest takeaway for you from The Body Keeps the Score?
You know, it's that message of hope. Van der Kolk doesn't pretend that trauma recovery is easy, but he also says very clearly that healing is possible. Even from the deepest wounds, the human spirit can heal and thrive.
So no matter what we've been through, we still can grow, connect, and find joy. That's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's a call to action, you know, to create a world where healing is not just something that can happen, but something that should happen. A world where we understand trauma, we offer compassion, and we provide support.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What can you do in your own life and in your community to make the world more trauma-informed and compassionate?
It's a great question. And remember, even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a huge difference in someone's life.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. We hope you found these insights from The Body Keeps the Score valuable and that you feel a renewed sense of hope for healing and transformation.